The storm came without warning. One moment the sky above the Ashenvale Mountains was a pale, bruised gray, the kind of gray that old women in villages called wolf-belly clouds, and the next, the world had gone white. The wind shrieked down from the northern peaks like something alive, something angry, tearing through pine branches and scattering snow in thick, blinding curtains across the mountain pass. Mara pressed her back against the stone wall of her house and listened to it groan. The house had been groaning a lot lately. It was a goblin's house, or at least, that was what the people in the valley below called it, when they called it anything at all. Mara was not a goblin in the storybook sense, not a creature of malice or theft. She was a Greyveld, one of the old folk who lived in the high places, whose skin had taken on the color of mountain slate over generations, whose ears curved slightly at the tips, whose eyes were the pale amber of frozen river water. The valley people had many names for her kind. Most of them were not kind names. She had lived in this house for 11 years. Her mother had lived in it for 40 before that. The walls were river stone and packed clay. The roof was larch timber and old thatch, and once, it had been solid and warm and full of the smell of dried herbs and wood smoke. Now the eastern wall was cracked from foundation to roofline. The crack had appeared in autumn, after a rockslide loosened the hillside above. She had packed it with clay and moss and hoped. But clay and moss were not enough for what this storm intended. Mara heard the eastern wall shudder. She crossed the single room of her house in 4 steps, pressing her palm flat against the cold stone. She could feel the vibration in it, the trembling of something being pushed beyond its endurance. Above her, a thin stream of snow dust filtered down from the ceiling where the thatch was separating. "Not tonight," she whispered to the wall. "Please, not tonight." The wall answered with a sound like a deep, slow exhale, and then a section of it, perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, simply fell inward. Cold air hit her like a fist. Snow poured through the gap in a white cascade. The wind found the hole and screamed through it, knocking her clay pots from the shelf, scattering her carefully dried yarrow and sage across the dirt floor, extinguishing the fire in one brutal gust. Mara stood in sudden darkness and cold and silence. The silence that comes just after catastrophe, before the mind has understood what the body already knows. She was in serious trouble. She dressed in everything she owned. 2 woolen tunics, a leather vest, her heavy outer coat that had been her mother's, oiled hide from a mountain elk, patched 6 times at the elbows. Thick socks, boots wrapped with strips of hide she'd cut from a ruined bag. She tied a scarf around her head and face until only her pale eyes showed. She looked at what remained of her house. The fire was dead. The eastern wall was open to the storm. Even if she blocked the gap with her sleeping pallet and her storage chest, even if she managed that, the temperature inside the house would drop to deadly within the hour. She had no dry wood left inside. The woodpile was outdoors, already buried under 2 feet of snow and more falling every minute. She had 2 choices. She could stay and freeze, or she could walk down into the storm and try to reach, where? The nearest human settlement was Delvara's Crossing, for miles down the mountain pass. In this storm, in the dark, for miles was an eternity. She did not know if there was shelter between here and there. Mara was not a woman given to self-pity. She had lived alone in these mountains since her mother died, and she had learned that self-pity was as useless as an umbrella in an avalanche. So she did not cry. She picked up her walking staff, tucked her small belt knife into her boot, wrapped her scarf tighter, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit her hard enough to stagger her sideways. She found her footing, bowed her head, and walked. The mountain in a blizzard is a different country. Every landmark disappears. The path becomes a suggestion beneath knee-deep snow. The cold is not merely cold. It is a presence, a weight, something that presses against you with purpose, looking for the gaps in your clothing, the exposed skin at your wrist where your sleeve has ridden up, the edge of your ear where the scarf has slipped. Mara had grown up in these mountains. She knew them the way some people know music, not by thinking, but by feeling. She navigated by the angle of the slope beneath her feet, by the way the wind shifted when she passed the 3 tall pines she knew stood at the first bend of the path, by the faint sound of Coldwater Creek somewhere below on her left, its running water a thin murmur beneath the storm's roar. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she saw the light. Not down in the valley, not the distant smear of Delvara's crossing that she'd been aiming for. This light was close, perhaps 200 yards off the path, up a small rise where she knew there was a stand of old hemlock trees. A warm, orange light, the unmistakable color of firelight. She stopped. The light could mean shelter. The light could also mean danger. She was a Greyveld woman alone in a storm. The valley people's dislike of her kind ranged from mild contempt to something uglier. She had been chased off a road before. She had been refused a sale at a market stall before. Once, 7 years ago, 3 men from the valley had come up the mountain with the specific intention of burning her house, and she had only avoided that by being not at home. She stood in the storm and weighed her options. The wind chose for her. A gust hit her sideways with such violence that she stumbled 3 steps off the path and nearly fell, and in that stumble, she caught a branch with her staff, steadied herself, and realized her fingers inside her gloves had gone entirely numb. Frostbite waited for no philosophy. She turned toward the light. The structure she found when she pushed through the hemlock branches was not a house. It was a hunting shelter, what the mountain people called a stayover, a small, low building erected at intervals along the hunting trails of the high country for use by anyone who needed it. This one was perhaps 10 feet by 12, its walls cut timber, its roof steeply pitched to shed snow. A metal chimney pipe jutted from the roof and breathed orange sparks into the storm. Someone was already inside. Mara hesitated at the door, a heavy thing of planked wood, latched from the inside. She could see the warm light through the gap at the bottom of the door. She could hear, faintly, the crackle of a fire. She knocked. There was a pause. Then a voice, low, male, cautious. "Who's there?" "A traveler," she said. Her voice was rougher than she intended. "Cold did that. My shelter collapsed. I'm asking for a place by your fire until the storm breaks." Another pause. Longer this time. "Are you armed?" She almost smiled. "A belt knife. I'm not planning to use it." "Step back from the door." She stepped back. She heard the latch lift, heard the door scrape against its frame, swollen with cold, and then it swung open. The man in the doorway was tall. That was the first thing she registered, the height of him, filling the low door frame, one hand on the door and the other resting on the hilt of a hunting knife at his hip. He wore heavy traveling clothes, dark furs over a wool shirt, and his hair was dark and close-cropped, his jaw covered in several days of beard. He looked to be perhaps 35, though his eyes were older than that. They were dark eyes, very steady, very watchful. Those eyes moved over her quickly, her staff, her bundled shape, the scarf around her face. Then they moved to her ears, where the scarf had pulled back slightly. He could see the curved points. He could see the slate-gray skin of her forehead. His expression did not change. That was unusual enough that she noticed it. "Come in," he said, and stepped aside. The stayover was warm. Wonderfully, painfully warm. There was a small iron stove in the corner, its belly glowing red, a stack of split wood piled beside it. A sleeping mat was unrolled against one wall. A hunter's pack, large, well-worn, leaned against the opposite wall, and on the small table between them sat a tin cup, a canteen, and a strip of dried meat. The man, the hunter, had clearly been here for some hours. The fire was established, the shelter was dry, his gear was organized with the practiced efficiency of someone who spent a great deal of time alone outdoors. Mara stepped inside. The door swung shut behind her. She stood for a moment and simply let the warmth hit her, felt it move across her skin like something merciful. "Sit," the hunter said, nodding toward a 3-legged stool near the stove. She sat. She began unwinding her scarf with numb fingers. He didn't watch her do it. He turned his back, busying himself with his pack, giving her privacy, or giving himself something to look at that wasn't her face. She unwound the scarf and let it drop around her neck. She pulled off her gloves and held her hands toward the stove and waited for the pins and needles pain of feeling returning to her fingers. "Storm came fast," he said, still not looking at her. "Yes," she said. "Your shelter, far from here? Half a mile, perhaps. Up the north slope. Bad location in a rockslide winter. I know that now." He glanced at her then, just briefly, something in her dry tone catching his attention. He almost smiled. It was a small, controlled almost smile, there and gone. "Rolf," he said. It was his name, offered without ceremony. "Mara," she said. He nodded. He took a second tin cup from his pack and poured something from the canteen into it. Water, she thought. But when he handed it to her, it was warm and tasted faintly of pine and something sweet. A trail drink. Hot. She drank it and said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing adequate to say, and because the warmth of it spreading through her chest made words feel clumsy. Thank you, she managed. He sat on the edge of his sleeping mat, elbows on his knees, and looked at the stove. It's a stayover, he said. It's for anyone who needs it. Still, she said. He nodded once, accepting that, and they sat in the sound of the fire and the storm. Rolf, she learned over the next hour, was a hunter out of Delvara's Crossing, not a man she'd seen before, though she made occasional trips to the village. He hunted the high passes for mountain elk and lynx, taking pelts down to the tanneries in the valley towns, ranging wide and alone for months at a time. He was, she understood, comfortable with silence. More comfortable than most people. He didn't fill the quiet with nervous talk the way people sometimes did around her. He fed the stove, checked the chimney draw, sharpened a small blade with a whetstone he produced from his boot, and asked her occasional questions that were simple and practical. Was she hungry? He had dried meat and hardtack and some trail mix of nuts and dried berries. She said she wouldn't take his food. He put hardtack and a handful of the nut mix on the table beside her without comment and went back to sharpening his blade. She ate it. Was the collapse total? She described the wall. He listened without interrupting and said, after a pause, that riverstone construction was vulnerable to hillside movement, that the clay binding was the first to go, and that in his experience, once one wall went in a storm, the roof followed inside an hour. She said she suspected the same. He nodded and said nothing else, and she was grateful that he didn't say I'm sorry, which would have made her want to cry, and she was not ready to cry yet. Had she family in the valley? No, she said. Her mother had been the last. He accepted this with a nod that was not pitying, just acknowledging, and said that he had a brother in Delvara's Crossing, but that they didn't speak much. He said this in the way people say things they mean to say lightly, but that are not light. She didn't ask further, and he didn't offer further, and they sat with their two separate solitudes side by side in the firelight. Around midnight. She guessed at midnight by the depth and quality of the darkness outside, by the way the storm had shifted from its first violent energy into a long, steady, relentless snowfall. Rolf said, "You can take the mat. I'll sleep sitting up." She looked at him. "That's your mat. You're cold. A cold person should sleep flat. I've slept in worse positions." "I don't doubt that," she said. "I still won't take your mat." "Then we'll both be stubborn and cold," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it. "Cut it in half," she said. He blinked. "I'm not cutting my mat in half." "Then roll it in half. 2 narrow sleeping surfaces. You sleep on one side, I'll sleep on the other." She paused. "I won't bite you." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the mat. Then he said, with the brevity of a man who was tired and cold and willing to be practical, "Fine." They slept on the divided mat, backs to each other, 3 feet of distance and the warmth of the stove between them, and Mara had not been this warm in weeks and was asleep in minutes. She woke to silence. The storm had stopped. She could tell immediately, the absence of wind, the quality of the light coming under the door, pale and sharp and clean. The stove had burned low but still held coals. The shelter was cool but not cold. Rolf was already awake. He was sitting against the wall, doing something with a strip of leather and a length of cord, some gear repair. He glanced up when she moved. "It broke 2 hours ago," he said. "Light in about 40 minutes." She sat up. Her body ached in the specific way of cold sleeping, every joint reminding her it had been asked to do something unreasonable. She stretched and looked around and let the fact of the morning settle over her. Her house was gone, or as good as gone. The storm had given her a night's shelter, and now it was done, and she had to decide what came next. Rolf was watching her without appearing to watch her. He had that quality, a hunter's quality, of seeming to look at something else while seeing everything. "You'll need help with the wall," he said. She looked at him. "The stone won't have gone anywhere," he said. "If the wall fell inward, the rock is still there. River stone can be restacked. The binding will need to be remixed, but I know a formula. Ash and clay and pine resin holds better than straight clay. My brother is a builder. I've done some repair work." "You're a hunter," she said. "A man can be more than one thing." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't know me. she said. And she meant more than she was saying, and they both knew it. He put down the leather strip and looked at her directly. He had that still, watchful quality in his dark eyes, and when he spoke carefully, the way someone speaks when they want to be precise and know the words matter. I know your shelter collapsed in the worst storm of the year, he said. I know you walked into a blizzard alone rather than freeze in a broken house, which means you're not a fool. I know you shared a sleeping mat with a stranger rather than argue yourself cold, which means you're practical. And I know you said please in the middle of this storm. I heard it, when you were knocking, just before you knocked. You said please to the door. He paused. That's what I know. It seems like enough to help with a wall. Mara stared at him. She had not realized she'd said that aloud. The pleas she'd breathed against the door, the involuntary, private, desperate pleas, she had not realized it had been heard. She started. Don't, he said simply. Not unkindly. Just a man who didn't want to be thanked for paying attention. She closed her mouth. They left the stayover at first light. The world outside was transformed. The storm had left 3 feet of new snow on the pass, and the morning was brilliant. The kind of sharp, crystalline mountain morning that came after blizzards, when the sky was a blue so deep and clean it almost hurt, and every surface caught the early sun and threw it back in sparks. Mara led the way up the slope to her house. She braced herself as it came into view. The eastern wall had indeed collapsed. The section of wall lay in a rubble of stone and frozen clay across her floor, which was now invisible under snow that had blown in through the gap. The roof had held, barely, partially, but one corner had sagged where it lost the wall's support. Her pots were smashed. Her herb bundles were scattered and ruined. The sleeping pallet she dragged across the gap before leaving was frozen stiff across the rubble. She stood at the threshold and looked at it. 11 years. Her mother's 40 before that. She felt something move through her, not grief, exactly, but grief's quieter cousin. The acknowledgement of a loss. The weight of seeing something that has always been there suddenly, permanently, changed. Rolf stood beside her and was quiet. He looked at the collapsed wall with a builder's eye, assessing rather than sympathizing. The foundation stones are solid, he said at last. That corner pier held. The wall fell outward at the top and inward at the bottom. That's actually good for restacking, means most of the stones are already in rough order. She looked at him. Outward at the top, inward at the bottom. How did you determine that from? The fall pattern. The stones that came in are the ones that were near the crack. The outer stones stayed higher. See, he pointed. She looked. He was right. You said the crack was there since autumn. The wall failed at the point of the old fracture, rotated on the base. If the base had gone, you'd have lost the whole thing. You actually know what you're looking at, she said. I spent 3 winters helping my brother rebuild a mill, he said. Stone and clay and timber, it's all the same principles. He turned and looked at the slope above. You'll need to dig out those foundation stones before you restack. They'll have shifted in the slide. Maybe a handspan, but enough to matter. He looked at the chimney, which still stood, improbably, though leaning slightly. Chimney can be straightened. I've got rope. You have rope in your pack. I usually have rope in my pack. She looked at him for a moment. This hunter who was standing in the ruins of a Greyveld woman's house on a mountain in the bright cold morning after a blizzard, cataloging her chimney lean and her foundation shift with the calm practicality of someone who intended to fix them. Why, she said. He looked at her. He knew what she was asking. Same reason as before, he said. It seems like enough. They worked all day. Rolf was efficient and knew what he was doing. He showed her how to clear the foundation line before restacking. The way you had to pack the base stones in a specific order, the heavy ones first, oriented against the hillside load. He mixed the binding paste, wood ash from the cold stove, the clay she had in her storage chest that had survived, pine pitch he collected from 3 trees on the slope above, heated together in her surviving pot over a fire he built in the open air. It was gray and thick and smelled of the forest. Your mother's recipe? He asked. No. Hers was straight clay. That's why it cracked, he said, not unkindly. They restacked the wall stone by stone. Mara was stronger than she looked. The Greyveld were, generally, and she could lift and hold stones that would have needed 2 valley men to maneuver. Rolf worked beside her without remarking on this, accepting it as useful rather than strange. By midday the lower half of the wall was rebuilt and the binding was setting. They ate his dried meat and her. She found Tucked under the fallen pallet, a cloth bag of dried lentils that had somehow survived. Lentils she cooked in the pot over the outdoor fire, with melted snow for water and a fragment of dried onion she found in a coat pocket. It was not a fine meal. It was hot and filling, and they ate it standing up, and it was one of the better meals she could remember. The upper wall took the afternoon. Rolf showed her how to angle the cornerstones slightly inward. Counterintuitive, but it makes the wall push against itself instead of away from itself, and she watched his hands and understood and did it herself while he held the guideline. By the time the sun was dropping behind the western peaks, the wall was rebuilt. Not beautiful. The stones didn't match perfectly. The mortar lines were rough, but solid. Solid in a way the old wall, for all its years, had perhaps never quite been. He straightened the chimney with rope and wooden bracing, packing the base with the remaining binding paste. She restrung what herb bundles had survived along the sheltered south wall. He repaired the sagged corner of the roof with 2 poles lashed into a temporary prop while she patched the thatch above with pine boughs until she could get proper material. The fire inside the stove was lit as the last light left the sky. They sat inside the house, her house, rebuilt, small and smoky and warm. And there was a particular quality to the silence between them that had changed from the silence of the night before. The night before had been the silence of strangers forced into proximity by circumstances. This was something else. This was the silence of people who had spent a day working alongside each other, who had learned the rhythms of each other's movements, who had handed things to each other and caught things and made small practical decisions together for hours, and who were now simply tired in the same room. "You'll need to do the north face of the thatch before the next snow," he said. "I know," she said. "I can get proper binding pitch from the valley. My next trip down is in a week, maybe 10 days. She looked at him. "You're staying on the mountain?" "I have a second stayover, further up the pass. Better hunting grounds to the northeast this time of year. I'll camp up there for a while." He paused. "I'll come back through here on my way down, if you need the pitch." She understood that this was an offer and that he was making it carefully, without pressure, in a way that she could decline without awkwardness. "The pitch would be useful," she said. He nodded. That was all. She looked at the rebuilt wall. In the firelight, the rough mortar lines cast small shadows. It looked different from the old wall. Rougher, newer, the stones less settled. It would take years to look the way the old one had. But it would stand. "Rolf," she said. He looked up. "I'll have proper food when you come through," she said. "Not lentils." Something shifted in his face. That same almost smile, but less almost this time. More present. "I'll look forward to that," he said. He left in the morning, early, while the sky was still more dark than light. She heard him go, the creak of the door, the crunch of his boots in the snow, and lay on her sleeping pallet, salvaged, dried, spread beside the warm stove, and stared at the ceiling. Through the new roof patches, the pine boughs made a different pattern than the old thatch had. Darker, more irregular. She would need to fix it properly. She would need to do the north face before the next storm. She would need to restock her herbs, her food stores, her clay supply. There was a great deal to do. She listened to the mountain morning, the silence of deep snow, the distant call of a bird, the creek somewhere below still running under the ice, patient and constant. Her house stood around her. She got up and started a fire. 10 days later, Rolf came back through the pass on his way to the valley, his pack heavy with pelts. He came around the southern bend of the path and stopped. The north face of the thatch was done. Properly done, with real larch thatch that she had traded for at a lumber post 2 miles down the eastern trail. Traded with what? With dried herbs, with a carved horn cup, with half a day of labor stacking timber. The chimney stood straight. The rebuilt wall was settling, the mortar darkening as it cured. Smoke rose from the chimney. He knocked. She opened the door. The smell that came out of the house was extraordinary. Herb bread, dark and dense, baked in the old clay oven she'd rebuilt in the corner. A pot of bean and mountain onion soup on the stove. 2 tin cups already warming on the shelf. She had a bruise on her cheekbone. She'd been up on the roof and slipped and caught herself on the edge, and her hands were rougher than they'd been 10 days ago, and there was clay under her fingernails that hadn't entirely come out. And she was standing in the doorway of her rebuilt house on a mountain where she had been alone for 11 years, and she looked, Rolf thought, like someone who had decided something. He held up the pot of pine pitch. She held up a cup of something hot. "Come in," she said. He came in. Outside. The mountain was the mountain, patient and indifferent and vast, the way mountains are. The pass wound down through the hemlocks toward the valley and up toward the high cold places where hunters went alone. The creek ran under the ice. The pines held their weight of snow. The smoke from the chimney rose straight up into the clear air, unhurried, and the house stood where it had always stood, on the shoulder of the slope, its new wall a little rough and a little pale against the old stones, but standing, the way things stand when they have been broken and put back together with enough care to be stronger at the cracks. The storm was long gone. Something else had arrived instead.